University. My name is Calvin Hadley. I have the pleasure of serving as the Strategic Initiative Advisor to President Frederick, as well as the Student Ombudsman, and I also have the pleasure of serving as the Administrator for the King Chair Lecture Series. Before we get started, I want to give you guys a few words on the King Chair Lecture Series. We are joined by one of the namesakes of the King Chair, Ms. Gwendolyn King, who along with her husband, Colbert King, Mrs. King, Mrs. King, along with her husband, Colbert King, are phenomenal alum of this university. They both graduated in the 1960s, and as a part of their alum duties, they donated to the university and started the King Chair Lecture Series. Each year, we bring up various holders of the chair who are leaders in public service, and their task is to come to our campus and ensure that our students and our community members learn from their experiences and get a chance to ask them questions about moving forward in this world. This year, we are lucky enough to be joined by the former FBI Director, Mr. James Comey, who is our holder of the chair and has now presented his 4th of 5 lectures. This is a little bit different, and I won't spoil the fun. I'll allow Mr. Comey to give you a little bit about why this is different. But I'll start by thanking Mrs. King and the King family. I would also like to recognize Ms. Elaine Jones, who is one of the former holder of the chairs. Ms. Jones. Thank you both very much for your dedicated service to this university. With that, we're going to have a phenomenal event. We have a number of student leaders who are going to join Mr. Comey in this discussion, and I would like to bring up Mr. James Comey.
Thank you, Calvin. Thank you, all of you, for coming here today. We hope this will be a stimulating conversation, both among the folks you'll see up on the stage and with the folks who are in the audience here today. As Calvin said, this is the 4th in the lecture series events. The first was me talking, and students were patient enough to listen to me and then go to the microphone and ask good questions. The next one was we invited folks from Birmingham, Alabama to come talk about what are their opportunities and their challenges in Birmingham. What are they working on? What are they making progress on? And what are they not making progress on? And then the third in the series was with myself and Justin Hansford from the law school talking about our perspectives. Me as someone who's spent most of his career in law enforcement, and Justin, who's been very active and is now setting up a new civil rights center here at Howard University, very active in Black Lives Matter and some of the aftermath of Ferguson, Missouri. And so the two of us had a conversation. And in each of those events, the one I spoke in, the Birmingham one, and then the one with Justin, people went and asked questions at the microphone. And folks said to me after that, hey, how about you engage the students directly? Wouldn't it be better than having people have to wait at the microphone? What if they could participate in the conversation? You say, as I have said, one of the reasons you're here is to try and model what a conversation about a hard topic looks like. And so I thought, that's a great idea. We'll have a panel where we'll have students from different backgrounds sit on the stage, and I will ask them questions. And it gives you some sense of what an egomaniac I am. It didn't occur to me that there's a better way to do it. And it was suggested by the students themselves. They said, hey, why don't you be one of the panelists? Why don't we have you, this is probably my tall microphone here, but it's only because of height, not rank. Why don't you join a conversation that's moderated by a student? And I thought, that's genius. Why was I so blind that I couldn't see that would actually be a better conversation? And so our moderator today is going to try and engage all of us up on the stage in a conversation that will then be the prelude to the conversation with you after we're done talking to each other. Again, our goal, we have focused all of the lecture series events on the intersection of law enforcement and race in the United States. One of the hardest questions imaginable, and one that episodically gets more or less attention in the public square in America. The students of Howard said to me, we want you to focus on that for all of the lecture series, and so we've done that. But our secondary goal is to show, as I hope Justin Hansford and I did last week, what it's like for people who may even see the world very differently to have an intelligent, difficult conversation with each other and learn from each other and teach each other. And so, having raised expectations unreasonably high, I now would like to invite to the podium Maya Redman, who is going to be our moderator. Maya.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Maya Regman. I'm a freshman business management major from Westchester County, New York, and I'll be moderating this panel. Tonight, we're looking forward to having a very interesting discussion on law enforcement and race. As Howard University students, we find ourselves to be in a special place here at the Mecca, where somebody is in office. And with that, we still come from various different perspectives, and we all play a pivotal role in the way that this country will be moving forward. So with that, I would like our student leaders to please join us on the stage. Thank you. So beginning with Dante Bell, we will be doing introductions. So Dante, if you could do your Howard intro, the organizations that you're in, why you're serving on this panel, and since you are a senior, please share on what you're doing after graduation.
Sure. Thanks, Maya. Hello, everyone. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dante Bell. I am a graduating senior economics major, Portuguese minor, originally from Seattle, Washington, but I've moved around quite a bit. I'm also the cadet wing commander for the Air Force ROTC Detachment 130. I'm based here at Howard University, which also stations 8 other universities in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Today, I am here to discuss basically what being a person of color in an institution that protects the Constitution and other institutions of this country has to do with being a person who is representing the interest of what really matters here. So yeah, I'm interested in a very engaging conversation with all the panelists here, and I'm excited to see what's next.
Thank you. Amos?
Hi, good evening. My name is Amos Jackson III, a junior studying political science and Africana studies from West Palm Beach, Florida. I have the distinct pleasure to serve as the College of Arts and Sciences Student Council President and the 58th HUSA President-elect, Howard University Student Association. I'm also a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated Beta Chapter. And I'm here today to serve as the student voice here on the panel along with everyone else, but also to serve as the voice for student activism, which is a very deep part of our fabric here at Howard University Students in Truth and Service, to give a very different perspective on why we're here and the discussion that we're here to discuss about today as far as law enforcement and race. And let's have a tough discussion with real answers.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Jordan Jean. I'm a graduating senior from Palm Beach County, Florida, political science major, legal communications minor. I serve as the president and founder of Howard United, an organization that came about on campus last November to try to bridge the political gap and some of the bickering that we had at our university and to have these tough conversations. I'm lucky to be on the panel, and I hope that we do have a thought-provoking conversation and that I can learn from you all as well as hopefully learn from my perspective. After graduation, I'll be attending George Washington University School of Law, and where I hope to further conversations like this. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Taryn?
Good evening. My name is Taryn.
No, move it closer.
Okay. Good evening. My name is Taryn Wilkins. I'm a freshman political science major from Jackson, New Jersey. I'm a member of the Freshman Leadership Academy, and I serve as an intern for the College of Arts and Sciences Student Council. Today I'm here to kind of give a perspective on what it's like to be a child of an African American in law enforcement. And I'm really excited to have this conversation.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Grant, a graduating senior, legal communications major, administration of justice minor from Rocky Mount, North Carolina. I have the pleasure of serving as the Howard University NAACP president, as well as on the national board as well. One of the things that I am super excited about tonight is that we're able to have intellectual debate as well as expand our minds and challenge the status quo. And so I think that this is a great place to do it. I think this is a great place to have those debates and then also get something out of it. So that's why I'm here, and I'm excited to be here, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. So with that, I'll be beginning with our first question. Recently, the city of Austin, Texas has been terrorized with racially motivated bombings. One of the killed was Jalen Mason, a 17-year-old honors student who was due to come to Howard in the fall. The FBI has come under fire on social media, where many point to how the institution tracked the movements of civil rights activists in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but released the following statement recently. We don't know a lot about the bomber, to be honest about you. What does this and other situations like this say to you about the way violence is viewed by the federal government when perpetrated by people of color versus whites?
Where do you want to start?
If you'd like to start.
Yeah, probably a good one. Well, thank you, Maya. It's too early for me to know in detail how the FBI participated in the investigation in Austin, but I'm able to answer the question in any event. The FBI has a long and important history protecting the rights of all Americans, including Americans of color, and at the same time also has a very difficult history from a counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO that ended up victimizing and particularly focusing in a vicious extra-legal way on leaders of the civil rights movement, especially during the 1960s, but extending into the 1970s. When I was director, one of the things I was really, really keen to do was to make sure that the FBI stared at that history. Because I believe that if you bury history, it doesn't get any healthier. And the people you're supposed to be serving and protecting, the FBI's job is to uphold the Constitution of the United States, won't forget that history. Even if you try and bury it, they will know it. And so when an FBI agent conducting an investigation, maybe like Austin, knocks on the door of someone who happens to be African American, that person will perceive that FBI agent in a way that the agent may not even realize because that person knows that history. And so I forced that organization to stare at that history and required that all trainees attend a course to learn that history. And then, and I've said this before, so I'll be brief, and then come at the end of the course to Washington and visit Dr. King's memorial on the tidal basin and take one of the quotes from the wall and write an essay to finish the course that talks about the intersection of Dr. King's words and the values the FBI is supposed to uphold and stand for. We didn't tell these young, talented people what to think. We just told them, this is the history, now think. It still is, I believe, the most popular course in the FBI training regime. It was misunderstood by a lot of FBI alums. I got some feedback, why is he attacking the FBI? And my response was, I'm trying to make sure we own our history and are honest about it so that we can be honest and transparent going forward and better serve and protect all Americans. So, if you're in law enforcement, whether you're in the investigative agency like the FBI or you're in uniform law enforcement, you must know the history of law enforcement in this country, and that it has, for decades, centuries even, been the enforcer of a status quo that was simply brutal to people of color, especially, and sometimes I worry the term people of color dilutes something that's really important to know, especially brutal and uniquely brutal with respect to black people, that group of people of color. You have to know that because the people you're trying to serve and communicate with will know that history as well, and you must own it and be honest about it and say, I know that history, and that's why I'm trying to be a different way going forward. And I'm sorry for such a long answer.
Thank you. Thank you. If anybody else would like to take the question.
Speaking to that point, I would also like to note that it's kind of disheartening to see the FBI's response in the bombing of Austin, especially over the last 2 years since the election of Donald Trump. After Ferguson, after the killing of Mike Brown, we saw a lot of attention on term coined that was given to Mr. Comey wasn't true about the Ferguson effect and the effect of protests and the killing of black bodies and how that's leading to across the nation of protesting and a race of people being upset. But it wasn't that same attention in November of 2016 when Donald Trump was elected, and then within a year, you saw the number of white nationalist groups double. And it's like, okay, so where's that attention for that group of people? Where is that same attention of, okay, now it's not just peaceful protests, you have people assaulting verbally and physically, taking over cities, marching, and spitting very racial slurs to people across the country. because of someone in office that carries their values. And so it's kind of disheartening to see that that same attention isn't there. And how do you expect someone to trust a department and or leaders in that department when that same thing isn't given back? And I think that's one of the main concerns of student activism and student protest here at Howard University regarding this issue, because it's not a fair playing field, and it needs to be so for us to have a very genuine conversation about it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I add a word on that, Maya? Because I think Amos has made a really important point. I think it's very important for all Americans, especially students, to constantly speak about what they see going wrong in the public square. I do worry, and remember I said in my introduction, there's kind of been an episodic focus on the relationship between law enforcement and race. It seems to have kind of gone away a little bit in the public square today. I think that's a big mistake. Our problems haven't gone away, and in some respects they have gotten worse as people feel emboldened to express views that are abhorrent. And so I do think it's really important that students stay engaged. One of my great worries about the current environment is people will become discouraged and just say it's all a mess. I'll wait. I'll wait for an administration that I support or think better about. There's no waiting. But American life is going on. People are being affected by changes that can happen in a blink of an eye in the United States. And so I encourage people to stay involved. Even though I'm not there anymore, and my tenure as FBI director under President Trump only lasted 5 months and didn't end in the best possible way, I think I can speak confidently and say, I know the Bureau is still doing that work. The FBI is divided into half in its counterterrorism work: international terrorism and domestic terrorism. Its domestic terrorism work is dominated by focus on groups that are sovereign citizen group, white supremacist groups, KKK groups. There are hundreds and hundreds of people in the FBI getting up every morning trying to figure out how are those folks trying to harm people and incapacitating them before they can harm them. I think that work continues. At the national level, though, above the director of the FBI, I think it remains important for our leaders to call out that behavior and not communicate that there's some sort of moral equivalence across between protesters in Charlottesville on both sides of the equation. That kind of thing does damage to our public square and is part of what leads to discouragement on people's part. So stay involved. Continue to demand answers. I'm proud of the way the FBI acted after Ferguson, and we can talk about that in detail. And a lot of what I've said, I believe, has been misunderstood. But continue to hold accountable those leaders at the top of the federal government and all the way down.
Thank you.
I think there's two things that the Austin bombing teaches us, but also something that we already knew that I think is reinforced. The first thing is we know that the FBI is largely white, right? Like 83% of special agents in the FBI are white. And so that it definitely goes against the growing diversity in America. And I think also that might have something to do with the fact that domestic terrorism committed by those that are white or white males goes under the rug, which I believe. The second thing is also that I think that we have fewer tools for charging domestic terrorists. So we have looked at, of course, the terrorism that comes from, Islamic State groups, but I don't think we have the necessary tools to look at domestic terrorism, or we haven't honed those tools to look at domestic terrorism in the way that we should. And so I think that those two things are critical when we're looking at things such as the Austin bombing and Charlottesville. Is what are we doing about domestic terrorism? It's not just knowing the history, which is definitely something that we need to do, but it's also changing tools, or using those tools, or getting tools so that we break that status quo. So I think that's definitely important when we're looking towards things like the Austin bombing and Charlottesville. Is what tools are we now putting in place? Knowing history is great, but what are the actions moving forward?
Yeah. And I think part of what plays into those tools is the media as well. And so the media paints these pictures of domestic terrorists on one side of the race spectrum as, oh, he was deranged, he had a mental health issue, but on the other side it's a radical Islamic terrorist or a goon or a thug or a black kid, black extremist groups. But the media also plays a part in that, to where, okay, now how am I supposed to trust you to deliver me the right news when you're delivering it on a bias and or false narrative? Call it what it is. It's domestic terrorism. regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of your socioeconomic background. It's domestic terrorism. And how are we looking to stop that across all races, across all demographic groups across the country?
Thank you.
Can I respond to what Jacqueline said, which I think is really important? You're absolutely right, Jacqueline, that our country could use more tools, legal tools, when it comes to domestic terrorism. One of the things that the FBI was pushing for when I was still there was to actually have a legal definition of domestic terrorism. I used to get myself tied up in all kinds of knots because I'm a lawyer and there isn't actually a legal offense called domestic terrorism. And so when people would ask me things like, well, is this terrorism? I'd have to hesitate saying, well, do you mean in the legal sense or do you mean in the way we'd commonly understand that? And so I do think there's some additional tools that could be had there. But don't let anybody use that as an excuse, because there's plenty of criminal statutes out there that aggressive investigators and prosecutors could use to lock people up for a long time who are engaged in some of this conduct. And so I do think there are additional tools that can be useful, but I don't want people saying, oh, I could be doing more if only I had this tool. As a director, I could be talking about it in a clearer way, but we still have the ability to lock these the terrorists, in my view, up, even under the existing statutes. And I'll say one word about, she's spot on about the FBI's problem with diversity, and she's got the number exactly right, Jacqueline. 83% of the FBI's special agents were non-Hispanic Caucasian when I was director, and that number had been growing steadily for over a decade. And I announced it was a crisis, and I think that also confused some people, but I believe it. An organization that depends upon the confidence and trust of the American people, a significant portion of whom are non-Hispanic, Hispanic or non-Caucasian, and an increasing percentage, which I think is a wonderful thing, the diversity in our country. If we become all people look like me, are we more effective or less effective? We're less effective. We're less able to operate in a way that is effective and accepted in a diverse country, and that's a crisis. And so I'll spare you all the details, but one of my director's priority initiatives, which I'm optimistic will continue and is making a difference already, was attract more great people to that work. Dare people to take a cut and pay and risk your life to do incredibly hard work. Because if people take the dare, they never leave. I don't care what you look like. You do that work, you find it addictive. And our problem was not enough people thought about us and thought about it as a place to work, in part because of the history. They don't realize this is what today's FBI is like. So I just want to echo what you said, Jacqueline. You're right on diversity, and you're right to be focused on tools, but I don't want that to be people's excuse.
To build off of what Mr. Comey said, I think that trying to expand diversity in an institution that is so contentious in some ways, an institution that has explicitly manipulated and taken advantage of Black and brown communities is difficult. I know that from personal experience here at Howard, being in the military, it's been hard to get students of color, Black students, involved in our program, particularly given who the current commander-in-chief is. So I think that while what you're saying makes sense, it makes a lot of sense on paper, I don't know if that's actually something that is as easily applicable in actuality, because for a lot of Black and brown people, for a lot of Black and brown students, we come from backgrounds that make serving in this sort of institution, in an institution like the FBI or law enforcement in general, really difficult, because it feels like, are you being a sellout if you join this sort of institution? Are you serving an institution that in some way, or maybe very directly, still exploits your people? And so I think that there's still a lot of conflict with that, and so I kind of asking both you and everyone else on the panel, how do you deal with that sort of conflict that might be going through a Black or brown student's head when they're thinking about whether or not to pursue what can be a very rewarding career, but might be different for that student of color?
I guess I'll answer first, since I tried to do it for 4 years. To try as best you can to get up close and show those Black and brown men and women what it's really like. Acknowledge the history and say, but let us show you what we're like today. The day I was fired, May 9th of 2017, I was in Los Angeles, learned I was fired from television. I was in Los Angeles to go that evening to a diversity agent recruiting event. We had done one in Washington, we'd done one in Houston, and this was going to be the biggest of all, where we invited men and women of color under the age of 37, because you got to be under 37 to join the FBI, who were lawyers or engineers or MBAs, people of demonstrated talent, to show them, I think we had about 700 coming, show them what this is really like, and have people currently in the FBI talk about it, warts and all, talk about our challenges, talk about our opportunities. And what we found in Washington and Houston was the yield was incredible. And by yield, I mean the number of people who walked out of that and said, I'm applying to be a special agent of the FBI, was transforming the FBI. We had one of our large classes at Quantico was 38% non-white. That's unheard of in an organization like the FBI, and it was a product of this work. And so there are many reasons why I'm sorry that I was fired, but I didn't get to go to that diversity recruiting event and say, you ought to take this dare. I've said this to y'all before, but I'll repeat it. One of my daughters summarized the problem. She said, Dad, the problem is you're the man. And I thought she meant that as a compliment, so I said, thank you. And she said, Dad, I don't mean that in a nice way. The problem is you're the man. Look at you. Right? Who would want to work for the man? And I said, you know, you're right, but you're wrong. Because if we could show people what the man and woman of the FBI are really like, they would want to be part of this, and they would know why no one leaves once they join that organization as a special agent. And so that's a very low-tech way to do it, but given the history and the obstacles you talked about, Dante, and I know the military faces some of the same challenges, you got to get up close and say, let me show you the life. Let me show you what it would be like and dare you to be part of it. And that one of the reasons I grieve not being there anymore is I'm an optimist by nature. I believe we were on a path, and maybe it'll continue. We were on a path to transforming that great organization.
Thank you. Maybe we got one more response to Dante's question.
I think that my dad's position of being the head of the internal affairs at his police department back home says a lot about it. Speaking to him about this, he says that, Mr. Comey, you brought this, you said that, you know, it's important to, those that are policing need to be reflective of those that they are policing, right? So the police department back home, it's very diverse. And like I said, my dad's an African-American sergeant, and the internal affairs department has an African-American, someone who's Hispanic, and a Caucasian person, right? And it's diverse, so you have different backgrounds and different perspectives, so it's important to get those. But the thing is that when you're trying to get in these new recruits, a lot of people of color don't want to join because of the stigma of police officers and being in part of the police, the law enforcement. So it is hard to do it, but the thing is that you have to bring people in and let them know that that's not really what it is about, right? But people feel more comfortable if they see that whoever is policing them, they come from the same background, they can understand them. So it is hard, because then it is, how do we bridge those gaps? There is a stigma, right? How do we break it? So it's things like that, having an African-American as the head of the internal affairs, someone who actually goes in and that is their job to investigate these acts of police brutality or police officers just not being ethical. So it is something that needs to be worked on, but the main thing is to have a police force that reflects those that they're policing.
Thank you, Sarah. Howard University and Mr. Comey made headlines last year when students, most notably those in organization HU Resist, protested Mr. Comey's being chosen to be a speaker at Convocation, as well as lead this lecture series. This will be a two-part question, one for the student panelists and one for Mr. Comey himself. For our panelists, what can we learn from protests, and how can we incorporate them into future conversations on law enforcement and race? And for Mr. Comey, how did you feel about Convocation and during this lecture series?
You want the students to go first, or you want me to go first?
You go.
Okay, you're tough. Thanks, Maya. I felt both energized, this is during Convocation, energized and a little bit frustrated. One of my worries, which I've said to you, is that especially young people will withdraw from the public square today. One of the great challenges we face in law enforcement is if great young people don't become police officers, someone will. Right? The jobs are going to be filled. And if they're filled by the kind of people that are in this room or filled by a very different room, that's going to make a big difference in the life of this country. And so seeing students passionate enough to interrupt an important event and chant, and clearly put some thought into it because their chants were awesome, frankly, and was inspiring in a way, because I thought, energy. People, even if I have a different view, they care deeply about this. We got to make sure we don't lose that. That's the excitement part. The frustration part was, I had something to say. I wanted to hear what they had to say. I thought, one of the things I was going to talk about was, I came to Howard because I thought there'd be no better place in the United States of America than here to have hard conversations. And a conversation is where you talk and I listen with an ear open to being convinced that I'm wrong, caring deeply about what you say, but it has a flip side where I talk and you listen, even if you think I'm an idiot, you understand it, okay, and then ask questions back. And the energy was flowing over and blocking our ability to have the conversation. That was the frustration part. And to be honest, as I was saying to the panelists beforehand, I'd never given a speech before while people were yelling at me, and that was a little odd and felt a little dreamlike to me, but that was my reaction to it. And then I thought, I hope these energized people will come and get up close to me. You may not agree with me, you may think I'm an idiot, but I'm an honest person who tries very hard to get it right and really wants to learn from people different than I am. And if they'll just see that, then we'll have a conversation. And the good news is, I've seen that in the lecture series. And I think part of it was Ta-Nehisi Coates and I had a conversation about this, and I think he encouraged people to come and said, look, get to know this person. Don't think about the institution. This institution, the FBI, was led by a human being. He happens to be on campus. Go listen to him. You may disagree, you may think he's an idiot, but listen to him and see what you can learn from him. And I think we've had more and more of those conversations that have spilled over, as I hope they will tonight, into the reception, where we talk while eating free food from the university. And there you go, I just put an advertisement for the reception. But so I have felt, and it could be wrong, there's always a danger I'm talking myself into this, but I have felt that embrace of the idea of conversation growing. It's not an admission. None of these people on the panel are admitting, because they're sitting at a table with me, they agree with everything I say, but they want to be part of a push and a pull so we can all get a little smarter. I've felt that growing, and I hope it's a real thing.
Thank you. And for our student panelists.
So your question was, what can we learn from student protests? I think that we could learn a lot, especially from groups like HU Resist. Even if we don't fundamentally agree with them or the way that they go about things. I know for me, like I said, I'm the founder of Howard United. They inspired us to let our voices be heard because we did not like the narrative. We did not like the way Director Comey was received, but we also did not agree with a lot of things that the FBI has done to African Americans over the years. But we respected the fact that Director Comey does not, represent the entire FBI. He's just an entity of it. But to say that it inspired us to start an organization and to get involved in politics, something that none of us that's a part of our organization was engaged in prior. We just did national or local politics, and this mic is really going in and out.
Yeah.
But we did national and local politics around DC, and it showed us a different perspective, because when you're in Washington and you're dealing with senators and congressmen and trying to get people elected, you aren't focused on what your colleagues, the people that look like you, that go to your classes, what they feel. And so what happened for me, at least I can speak personally, because my group is an organization that's, mixed with all type of ideologies. It showed me that, it's not just about me anymore. I have to have, if they're not willing to have the conversation with Director Comey, let me put myself out there and have that conversation in a respectful way. I hope it was respectful, Director Comey. And ask those questions and learn. And so I've learned from both HU Resist and Director Comey, and I'm continuing to learn, and that's why I'm on this panel. Not so much to, tell you guys what I think, but actually to learn from student leaders who have served this institution. And I believe people in HU Resist, they love this institution. They just have a different, way of showing that. So I've learned a lot from them.
Thank you.
I think that we as students, we as Black people, we as people part of a marginalized community need to completely rethink the way that we define protest. For example, being in the Air Force, you have a P-52 Mustang, which is an aircraft that the Tuskegee Airmen used many years ago, many decades ago, and you have the F-22 today. Both of those planes were meant to fly, but the P-52 is much different than the F-22. And likewise, I think protest needs to be different. People have been marching for a long time. but there are other ways of protesting that can be equally as effective, if not more effective today. Presence, being in a place, being a black person in a white place can be a form of protest. Being in a boardroom, owning a business, operating successfully, being a person in law enforcement who's making that difference and is showing maybe the next generation of leaders that you can be great as well. So I think that we as students need to recognize that by engaging in these type of conversations, that we're redefining protests today. And that our generation has a different way of looking at protests and engaging conversations and talking to different people and engaging with people that we might not agree with in a way that's so different and revolutionary that it doesn't foreshadow but respects the protests of the 60s, the protests of the Civil War even, and before, when slavery was actually, becoming a thing. People have been protesting for centuries. So our generation, our people, our community, marginalized communities everywhere need to rethink how they look at protests and how they're fighting an institution or fighting people who run an institution that exploits them or attempts to manipulate them and how they push back to that. Because there's so many ways of doing that. Whether you're, out in the streets holding up your sign and storming the gates of the White House, or whether you're, actually in the White House having a meeting with the president, whoever that might be. You can make a difference in whatever avenue you see fit as long as you're contributing to the greater good.
I would disagree on the point of changing of how we protest. I think we have to look at the deeper issue of why the protests have stayed the same. The reason that protests have stayed the same because of the same things that you mentioned about access, about ability, about seats in the boardroom. They have been denied. And so the only thing that hasn't changed, it's that. Like, protest is not going to change because the opportunities in which why we protest aren't there. The same thing for the March for Our Lives protest is going to be on Saturday. They tried having discussions, they tried having town halls, and nothing has changed. Like, no legislation has been put on the ballot, no legislation has been put on the Congress floor. And so now what we have to do is bring it to you so you can see what our issues are. And maybe if you can't have a sensible conversation, because protest is never supposed to appease, make you feel good, it's supposed to agitate. And the agitation is supposed to bring about a change. And the same thing here on campus as a student leader, like you have to support student protests, you have to support the protests the same protests that happened in the 90s in the A building, and the same protests that happened 2 weeks ago in front of the A building. There's a reason behind the protests. We don't need to change the protest, we need to change the reason of why the protest is happening. And the reason of that is because of honesty, transparency, and communication with those that are protesting. Because at the end of the day, you can change the protest, you can change to a different route of protesting, but if the fundamental foundation of why individuals are protesting is not changing, the same feelings, emotions, anger, disappointment, and why you're protesting won't change as well. So I think there's a deeper issue than just the matter of protest and the actual problem that's causing the protest.
Thank you.
So the question was what can we learn from the protests, and particularly what can we learn from convocation. One of the things, and I hope I don't misstep, but one of the things that I think that we could have learned first and foremost is that when coming into spaces where you know that there might be hostility, to address the hostility first. I think one of the things that Director Comey or Mr. Comey failed at was that it was a generic speech of how he came in as a student and was learning about the world, where the first thing should have been an "I'm sorry," or that I understand that the FBI has had this history pertaining to you and Black Americans, and this is how we can move forward. I think that should have been at the beginning, and so that if you were drowned out, at least that would have been the first thing that you said, so that students can then see that you were at the beginning willing to have that conversation. And so that's where I think that we could learn from there, is making sure that knowing where we are in the spaces that we're always cognizant, and that we don't delay, we say it right then, so that students can feel it right then. I think that would have changed the entire atmosphere of the convocation. If you would have heard an "I'm sorry" or "I get it," then I think that protest would have transpired a little differently. The second thing I'd say is that the protest taught me not to be intellectually lazy. And so when I love protests, don't get me wrong, I'm part of the NAACP, I love a good protest, okay? But at the same time, protest is to get attention to an issue. Right. Then we have to do something else, exactly. Right? And I think what I always challenge our students about is that we are very, very, quick to turn to something else. That's one of our flaws, and I'm okay with saying that. I'm okay with getting stoned for that. But one of our flaws is that we quickly turn to something else. There's a new hashtag, right? Whereas if we're going to protest, let's protest. Let's be in the A building. I'm with y'all. But as soon as we say, hey, we're going to actually talk to the people that we don't like or we don't agree with, and we're going to actually have the intellectual debate, then I need y'all to be there too. Exactly. And so I think that that's where we're at with it, and that's where I believe protest should be. It should always be strategic. Let me show you the issue first, and then let's sit down and talk about it so that legislation and so forth can move forward, and so that we can have these robust conversations in the entirety and continue to have those.
Absolutely. Thank you. That was a great point. Mr. Comey, would you like to respond?
I appreciate what she's saying. I don't remember it that way. I think folks started chanting before just as I got up. I don't know that anything I said would have been heard, so I disagree on the practical impact of it, but it's really good feedback in general, though, because I don't think, again, another example of being trapped in my own perspective. One of the dangers of being human is we're trapped in our perspectives. I knew how important the FBI's history was, which is why I tried to change the way we talked about it, but I think I dramatically underweighted how important it was to the students of Howard. And so I should have been smarter and more empathetic to understand it. I don't think I could have gotten a word out there, but I could have found other ways to communicate it. So I think in general, the feedback is fair.
Thank you. So this was very much so connected to what Jacqueline just said. But we've seen social media be used to advance protests like Black Lives Matter. But is there a way to utilize social media to help law enforcement and the like to better their relationship with citizens? Further, how do we galvanize people to not only protest but also build strategies?
I think social media has made protests and also our generation a little lazy when it comes to being a part of making a difference. Because it's a real quick retweet, it's a real quick reply, but are you really diving deep to actually see the necessary issues that are being discussed? Like that took over our election, like for example. Like a quick post on Facebook, a quick tweet can completely change the minds of voters, which can affect the decisions that are made on why people protest. And so really challenging individuals to make sure that you dive deep past the 280 characters or whatever it is now, and actually see like, what are they really talking about? Like, just don't read a headline, like read the article and then respond to the article. Just don't see the tweet, read the replies and see why you should either retweet it or support the person that said what they said, because it might have just been a first thought, but the discussion underneath really shows the underlying opinions of that person that tweeted that. And I think social media has done a bad thing on that side, but it's also done a good job of galvanizing and just support. Because like for a great picture, you can get 15,000 tweets, or for a march, or for just being able to create a sense of togetherness amongst people from all around the country, as we call it Black Twitter. Just one small thing can galvanize and support and bring people together on an issue that might have been an overthought prior to.
Thank you.
Well, I do think that social media is a good way of galvanizing people around a certain idea. I would be careful about how social media traps us in our own bubbles. So when we're on social media, when we're on Twitter, when we're on Facebook, Instagram, what have you, we're surrounded by people who probably think like us, who are interested in the same things that we're interested in. And so when you have an opinion, you probably already have your opinion. You go on social media and you see things that are already firm, what you already think and what you already believe. And next thing you know, you just have this recycling of information that you want to hear. And so I don't think that social media is a good place to have a valuable and meaningful discussion that expands your worldview, expands your horizon, and challenges you to think differently. I think that that's something that you can only get from interacting with other people. And I think that there's so much information out there, it's easy to consume misinformation, particularly on social media. I also think that, kind of tying this into protests as well with social media, it is, as Amos had said, it's good that social media calls attention to certain issues, But just like with many different forms of protests, it's not just about calling attention to something, it's about the action that it's going to bring afterwards. So if an incident in Austin, for example, catches a lot of traction on social media, now people are covering it, what is law enforcement actually going to do to make sure that hate crimes are prevented in the future, as an example, right? So I think that it does social media does a good job of getting information out there, but maybe not to the right audiences and maybe not demanding the proper or adequate action.
And I also would, to follow up on Dante's point, you have to have an urge to learn as well. So you can see the retweets, you can see the posts, but if you have hatred ingrained in who you are as a person, you can see 15,000 retweets, you can see 10,000 marches. It won't change the fabric of who you are. And so you have to be willing to learn, be willing to educate yourself, and be willing to make a difference in your own self to be able to make a difference in the communities that you're serving.
I would certainly say that social media, I love Twitter for sure, but one of the things is that social media can be a place where we are emotionally charged to do the right thing. And I think that emotions can't be the rest of it or the only bit of it. I think that we have to be driven by data as well, right? And so one of the things that this is weird, but I've read all of Comey's speeches, because that's what you do, right? Before you meet somebody, you need to know who they are.
It's a terrifying thought.
And so one of the things he said, which I agree with, now the reasons why we disagree on one thing, but the reason he said is that law enforcement has no ability to tell whether there's an epidemic of lethal force against African Americans because you are operating without data, right? And so if we are doing that, and the reasons why we don't have data, I disagree on why we don't have data. But the thing is, we don't have that data. And so we can retweet it, right? And we can get emotionally charged about it. But at the same time, I know we have talented scholars in the room who could, right, use that energy to then get that data and be like, okay, you got what you need. Now why are we still having this issue, right? And so I think that social media sometimes can be a scapegoat for us to all gather together about how we feel about things, but then when we have the intellectual capacity and ability to use the gifts that we have been given, and you know how Howard University has trained us to do, to use those gifts to then challenge the status quo in the system, I think we become intellectually lazy. And so I believe that social media puts us in this bubble, and we have to break that bubble, and we have to give the people what they want. You need data, we got scholars for you, so here's the data. And so I think that that's something that we need to be aware of.
Thank you.
I think that social media can be a blessing and a curse. I know, like, scrolling down like my timeline, I see a lot of people, for lack of a better word, like fake woke, right? People who just like to tweet the hashtags and stuff like that, but the same people who have maybe tweeting about gun reform, right? If I talk to them in conversation, have no idea that there's going to be a march on Saturday. So I just feel like it goes back to this idea of being intellectually lazy and making it clear what the difference between a moment and a movement is, because just because you tweet a hashtag, yeah, you support it on Twitter, right, for your followers to see that that's something you support, but are you actually taking the next steps to make action? Are you actually going to not just make it a moment so that you can get the likes or retweets? Are you going to put forth the action that really makes this to be more of a conversation, not just for your followers to see? So I think that that's really important.
And you know, I want to pick up on that. A lot of times, especially since we started our organization, when you go on Twitter, Howard Twitter, Black Twitter, you get called all type of names, and they chastise you because, as the songs say, they have Twitter fingers, and they feel emboldened that they can say these things. But like she said, when you get in front of them, they really have nothing to say. So my challenge is to those who are on Twitter who retweet, like Amos says, and they can get 15,000 retweets or whatnot. What really are you doing past tomorrow when that tweet is trending? What are you doing to make yourself uncomfortable to change these things? For instance, I see on Twitter, Howard Twitter, a lot about, you know, the capitalistic society. What are you doing? Are you saying, I'm no longer shopping at this place, I'm protesting it, just because you're not, and this is what I agree with Dante with, there are different forms of protest. So just because I don't march in the street doesn't mean that, you know, I'm not galvanizing people in my community to elect someone that represents my values, you know, and that's where the real work comes down to. I really don't care if you can retweet and you can get 22,000 followers on Twitter. I care, and I hope we all care here at Howard University, is how can we enact change? And yes, social media can bring attention to what's the issue, but if we're not pounding our feet to the pavement, i.e. going to the voting booth, knocking on doors for candidates that represent us, I think we're really just about the talk and not about the action. And we need to figure out how we can do the talk and then commit ourselves to the action, because this generation, and I don't want to get beat up for this, but I may, like she said, we're lazy. We want to be comfortable. And when we remove that comfort, like some of our student leaders here have, we're able to change things. So that's just my take on that.
Thank you.
And a lot of really important things have been said. Let me just quickly tie it to law enforcement. First of all, I agree. I think Amos started this talking about its laziness. I think social media reinforces one of the worst aspects of human nature and is inconsistent with one of the best aspects of human nature. It reinforces it in that the confirmation bias is one of the most terrifying forces in our existence. That is, my brain craves information consistent with what I already believe. And I may not even perceive consciously facts that are inconsistent with what I believe. And so in the world of Twitter, I can set it up so all I get is the love of confirmation. It's a little harder in my particular stage of life. There's a lot of hate on there, but I can set it up so that I'm told things I agree with all day long. That is so dangerous. Yes, it's a useful tool, but it also reinforces that bad part of us. Now, a good part of us, we're social animals. Someone once said we're partly bee, like the insect, because we need to form a hive, we need to connect to other people, and we do that through the way we read each other's facial expressions, the tone of our voice, the way our shoulders sit when we talk to each other. This is unscientific in a sense, but it's real. That's how we connect to other humans. Well, Twitter strips all that away. It's not possible to have that ancient bond, to form that hive with people, because you can't see them, you can't feel them, you can't hear their tone. So now to law enforcement's challenge. Law enforcement's got to be on Twitter because that's where so many young people are, and if law enforcement's going to communicate about its mission and what it's trying to accomplish, I get all that, but you're never going to change hearts and minds on Twitter. You're only going to be able to do that by getting up close and showing people who you are. You can't show people who you are through Twitter. And so it's a real struggle. I've talked to a lot of chiefs around the country about this. How do I show people what we're really like when I can't do it in a 280 character or a picture of a bike fair on Instagram? You got to do it the old-fashioned way. Try and get people to come up close to you and see what you're like in a non-digital way. And that's really hard. And Twitter also allows us to see instantly into every dive bar in America and watch what people are screaming at the television. And that's a bit of a distraction. We get caught up in we also love car crashes and fights. We get caught up in watching the battle back and forth on Twitter, and that distracts us from what really matters.
Thank you. One final question before we move on to Q&A from the audience. But what we've just been talking about, and the title of this specific installation, Moments and Movements, how do we take the social media moments that we've seen and that we've just been discussing and take it to law enforcement? We had this joke recently about how everybody has their personal FBI agent on Twitter. But how do we then take what we've learned and what we discuss so commonly amongst our peers and the CAF on Twitter and bring it to law enforcement?
In a safe space with no guns first, right? I think that there has to be someone that is willing to step aside from all those who aren't willing to go and then start that, right? Like, there has to be that one kid that's okay with being called, whatever it is they're being called, because they're reaching for it and trying to talk to an officer or to law enforcement. There has to be that one person, right? There's always going to be the black sheep first, right, before the rest of them follow. And so I think that there has to be that type of bravery and to be able to also be again, I keep going back to this, be intellectually challenged, right? There's a lot of stuff that we know or that we think we know until we meet someone else that has a different viewpoint from us, and then we're scared of that, for them to shatter that, right? So for us to be able to meet with law enforcement, they may have a different perspective, right? And sit down and have that conversation without it being so emotionally charged, right? Without it being so, well, I saw this video, right? And all the antidotes and stuff like that, which is important. It is important. But we have to be able to, we have this safe space where we can say, hey, I'm going to come to you, or you come to me, meet me halfway. And then we can have this discussion, and then we can move forward, right, with policy and stuff that works for the both of us. And I think that we have to do that by getting away from the bubble that we've created with each other, right? There's a comfort in the bubble that we've created with each other on how we feel about law enforcement, but no one's willing to step outside that bubble just yet. And I think we need to have somebody that's brave enough to do that.
Thank you, Jackie.
I think that the first thing, I agree with her, like what we're doing, talking to Director Comey, I think all of us have had private moments with him and the students have had. That's a step in the right direction. But once he leaves, what are we going to do? We have to go back in our communities and we have to engage with law enforcement. We here at Howard are the top co-ed black institution, and we have to send our students and we have to affirm them that it's okay to have these conversations. Like she said, it's going to be a black sheep. I know several people in my organization that have been called out, including myself, and that's okay. We have to have that courage, but as a community, as those that are sitting in the seats right here, you have to reaffirm that you can't continue to chastise people, because in this day and age, people care about their, social standing. So you have to, if you're too scared to do it, if you're too scared to be in that space, just why don't you back up a little bit and let them do them and let them talk to these law enforcement agents? Because I really believe that if we have that conversation, if we deal with human contact, things will start to change. My advice to police officers in Lake Worth, where I grew up, which is kind of like an inner city, I guess, was come meet us before the shooting happens. Talk to us before, someone's dead, before there's a robbery. And guess what they do? They have a police athletic league where our young kids now are engaged through flag football, and they're introduced to the police officers from an early age. And so there's a respect level on both ends. But as far as how we can change what we're doing here, is we have to stop bullying the kids that actually want to have that conversation. And if we're, like I said, if you're too scared to do it, just let them have that conversation. And then hopefully they can bring you a piece of information that you can stick to that's like, you know what, I'm willing to go next time. Or I have a perspective that I want to share because I see nothing happen to you. Let me be courageous enough to step up. So I think it just takes courage.
Thank you, Jordan.
Can I put in a plug for something I think Howard is doing that no one else in the entire country is doing? You are modeling exactly what Jacqueline's talked about, what we've talked about across this panel, and that is getting up close with law enforcement. There's a course taught here at Howard that's on this semester called Inside Out Policing, where half the enrollees in the class are Howard students, the other half are active duty police officers from the area. And I've talked to Dr. Muhammad about this, and she describes this phenomenon at the beginning of class where everybody comes in anxious. What will it be like? What will these kids be like? What will these cops be like? And they stay up close to each other, and they argue with each other, and they learn from each other, and they educate each other about what the world looks like through my eyes, through your eyes. And at the end of that semester, they are different people. They are all better, in my belief. And this is a pilot that's been done here at Howard. I think that course ought to be taught on every campus in this entire country. So thoughtful people bring together people who care deeply about getting it right, and by being together, they have a better chance of getting it right. Not going to be perfect, because humans are human beings, and we have challenges in this country that all of you know all too well, but we can get better if we invest in that up-closeness.
Thank you, Mr. Comey. I'd like to take this time to open up for questions. There's a microphone in the back.
Hello, my name is Nira Hayden. I'm a freshman Afro-American Studies major, sports administration minor from Baltimore, Maryland. And my question for the panel relates to gun laws and reaction from the public versus law enforcement when it comes to race and socioeconomic background. So my examples would be Columbine and Sandy Hook versus Parkland. So Columbine and Sandy Hook, the average median household income is half of what it is in Parkland. And so as a student, it was kind of frustrating to me to see, I'm excited that we're having these conversations and these protests, but why does it take it to be a community of people who are making more money than people that are less? And then this would continue when it comes to race with the murder of African American men and how it takes so long for that to be addressed.
Being that I literally grew up 30 minutes from Parkland. Like, I went to American Heritage School. Like, that was our rival in sports, Stoneman Douglas High School. And the reason why that probably is because a lot of those parents that lost their students and lost their kids in that massacre sat with the sheriff and eat lunch with the sheriff and eat lunch with the school board superintendent in Broward County. And that's because it goes back to that discussion that we were having about protests, about access. And so if you don't have the access, if you don't have a seat at the table, it's hard to get anything changed. And I think it's sad that it had to take this to make it to Washington, even on a further note, but it shouldn't have to get that way because students, because of parents, because of law enforcement, because of legislators have to be willing to understand that it shouldn't take an issue, it shouldn't take a massacre, it shouldn't take deaths in order for something to change. You get elected, you are chosen to represent your constituents on the right thing to do, not on the, well, this is what I want to do. There's a difference between right and wrong, and I think that a lot of times law enforcement legislators have failed us, and I think it's time to wake up and educate ourselves on the issues at hand and make sure we vote them out and make sure that we take the necessary civic duty of making sure that happens.
Thank you, Amos, and thank you, Nira, for your question.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Rashid Mohammed. I am a freshman political science major, Spanish minor from Atlanta, Georgia. And my question relates to what you all were speaking about earlier in terms of diversity, specifically within, the FBI and law enforcement in general. What would you say would be the antidote to handling the diversity within these spaces? So I know it's all fine and dandy to say, get up close and personal with, people of color and show them what it's like to work in law enforcement. But once they do, say apply, get accepted into these spaces, and are confronted with, the deep-rooted police culture, I know a lot of the precincts around the United States are corrupt in many forms. So in some cases you have, police officers of color that are forced to are forced to ascribe to this police culture. And so in those instances, yes, you have the representation in these spaces, but nothing has changed. So what would you say is the antidote to that problem?
I think
Go ahead. No, you take it.
Okay. I think that is an interesting point. I guess I kind of tried to, or not tried, but I kind of posed that question in a different way earlier. I'm going to answer my own question now and what you said as well. I think you have to look at it this way. In 2 months, I'm going to commission with the United States Air Force. That means I'm going to take an oath to protect and serve the Constitution of the United States. And if we remember correctly, the original Constitution wasn't so considerate of people that look like you and I. We also have to consider that since then, things have gotten much better, but are still not perfect. America was never great, but it always could be. And I think that that's something that you have to remember when you serve these sorts of institutions, that you're protecting the laws and the ability to improve, the opportunities to expand and protect the people who really matter here. Because that's what the American story is. That's what makes this country exceptional. the people who have fought for years and centuries and continue to fight today and will continue to fight for as long as America is a concept and nation. It's about protecting those freedoms moving forward. And I think that as a person who is serving in this sort of institution, that's what you have to remember and hold dear to you as you fight the good fight in your way. And by protesting the prejudice and things like COINTELPRO that's happened in the past and the very racist history of institutions like this is by, even though you had presidents who were slaveholders in the past, having the first black president just a couple years ago, and thinking about how great that was and how racist that institution historically was. You define what the future of these democratic American institutions are. And so I think as a person of color, you have to consider that wherever you go.
Thank you, Dante. Thank you, Rashid.
And the only thing, can I just add one thing to that? I would also encourage you not to paint with too broad a brush. There are 18,000 police departments in the United States. Some are great, I'm sure some are terrible. The question is, what department are we talking about? What's their culture like? And all human beings are flawed. There's corruption in all, I'm sure you already know this, even if you're just in college, there's corruption in all parts of human endeavor because people are flawed. The question is, what is the culture of the institution like, and what do they do to hold accountable those who violate their standards? And the FBI is an organization that is very different than it was 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and prides itself, I'm sure it still does when I was director, on very high standards, hires great people, can pick them from anywhere we want in law enforcement, and we still have to discipline and fire people for misconduct every year because they're human beings. Two meetings ago, we had the chief from Birmingham come here. A.C. Roper is a general in the Army Reserve, an ordained minister, and the police chief in Birmingham, Alabama. He grew up in Alabama where Bull Connor was the police chief. A.C. Roper was part of changing that community. He leads a police department now that's 70% African American, and he said a lot of his relatives looked at him like, what are you thinking, joining that part of the world? He said, I joined that part of the world because I wanted to change it. I wanted to be that change. And that man changed that community. And so there's lots of communities that could use an A.C. Roper, probably hundreds and thousands of them. But if you paint with too broad a brush, you can miss those and what we can learn from those, which is why I invited Birmingham to come here to talk to you all. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Comey.
Hi, my name is Gabrielle Matz-Carter, and I'm a freshman political science and French double major from Seattle, Washington. And my question, I'll build it. I know this series seems to be about building bridges between law enforcement and the African American community. I myself am an intern for the Embassy of Israel and just attended the AIPAC conference. So we had lots of difficult conversations about pro-Israel, Palestinian West Bank, lots of things that we were discussing. So my question is surrounding Howard University and our student community. How do we confront and combat, I feel like, the culture of a resistance towards difficult conversations? If you have a viewpoint that may be different than the, consensus or the, the political culture here, or just different types of thought process, how do we combat people that may just want to dismiss you as a person or dismiss your beliefs or opinions quickly because they don't resemble everybody else's? Because as your point, Director Comey, is so important that we have to have conversations in order to grow and in order to learn from each other. So how do we combat that resistance towards having difficult conversations?
I think the first thing is being, I think I spoke on this before, but being okay with being that black sheep, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I think it's so necessary, and I think that there comes, like, again, that bravery where there are going to be Howard students that are going to dismiss you regardless because they are set in their ways, right? And it takes someone that is willing to actually be like, okay, you know what? I know that you are going to change right now, but I'm willing to, and there are going to be people behind you. Like, let's be clear. Like, a lot of times you'll be the first person to speak, but a lot of people are thinking the same thing. And so when you do that, you then build an army, right? And they might not come all at once, right? Because they're afraid of the Twitter attacks, and they know they're about to be added soon, right? And they know that their meme is coming. But after they get past all of that, right? After they get past all of that, you then see that people will come towards you. And the great thing about you being the first one is that you get written down in history for being the first one, right? People will come and they'll be like, yeah, I knew her. I was there when, she decided to step left when everyone stepped right. But you'll be remembered for that, and people will eventually respect you for that. Let's remember as well that not all the leaders, but a lot of the leaders of our history, at first they were left, right? When we think about, we always talk about, MLK and so forth. MLK was a black sheep in his community before people got behind him. The civil rights movement was not, was not one of the greatest things for a lot of people. They didn't want to join at first, and your grandparents won't tell you that, but it's true, right? It's true, and so they waited, and then they saw that King was doing something, and then they joined, and so that's how movements start. To be honest, that's how movements start. Somebody becomes that person that's like, I'm willing to step aside. So I think that's what you need to do.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Gabrielle.
Hello, my name is Nima Mangai, and I'm a freshman political science economics double major from Boston, Massachusetts. And Mr. Comey discussed a course at Quantico that has trainees learn about the disturbing history of the FBI. And so my question is, would a course like this be helpful in the police academy in learning about police brutality and that history in the United States?
I certainly think so. For the reasons I said, the FBI is an organization that has strengths and weaknesses, has done things it should be proud of, has done things that it should be ashamed of. And staring at all of that is how you attract great people and how you improve. And so no matter who you are, I think you ought to talk about it. I know a little bit about New York City because I'm from the New York City area, and I believe the New York City Police Department, which is a multicultural organization now, does spend time talking about the history of NYPD and its enforcement of the status quo. So I think it's very, very important and could easily be done in police departments around the country. And I also think, even if you're cynical about it, it will attract people. Because they'll say, this is a forward-thinking organization that is willing to look back. You can't be forward-thinking without being willing to look backwards.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Comey. Thank you, Nima.
Hi, everyone. My name is Najan Washington. I'm a political science and economics double major from Buffalo, New York. And basically, my question is, many times the media is claimed to be like the fourth branch of government, and we see every day how much power the media has. So we talked a lot about how social media and the media can really sway the opinion on different topics. So how do we influence that culture, or if not influence it, lessen the power that media has on us today? Because I know many times we look at something in the media and, like you said, we don't take that extra step to see if it's true or not, but the reality is not a lot of people are going to see if it's true or not. So how do we then now look at how we will now portray the media, or how we will take it?
Do you want me to go first? Because I have some media experience. I think in two respects, and I really would be interested, because the panel is more qualified than I in this respect, because I think they understand the power and the challenge of the way in which, especially young people, get their information today. So as an old guy, I'll go first, and I'll ask them to follow me. The first is, have the character and integrity to avert our eyes. Mm-hmm. The media lives on the fact that we can't stop looking at car crashes. Right? It's just a part of human nature. Why is there always a long traffic jam on your side of the road when the accident is on the other side of the road? Because when everybody gets to the front, they have earned the right to stare and see what they can see. And that's just who we are. Unfortunately, the way we get our information today on the devices, we can look at car crashes, and I mean that metaphorically. We can look at disputes and scandal all day long. We have to have the discipline to say, you know what, I'm actually a better person than that. That's really, really hard. And the second thing is, by understanding that there is a thing called the truth. Right? There's lots of things in the world that are my perspective, your perspective, right, that are out here, but there's a core of things that are true or false. Not letting that be destroyed, not giving up on fighting for what is true. As exhausting as it can be, stay in there, stay involved, and say, no, actually that's false, and here's how you know it. Not allowing, there's this expression, right, that a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. In the age of the mobile device, a lie makes 100 laps around the world before the truth is out of bed. We have to know that and fight it, and speak the truth into that avalanche of zeros and ones that are coming at us through the digital world, but understand that if we don't do that, the lies will win.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that we also have to hold these media outlets accountable, right? Like the way that the suspect was painted by the media, and like in contrast to what he may or may not have been, would have been painted had he been African American. I think that if you hold these media outlets accountable, it sheds light that it's not true journalism, right? But you also have to take it upon yourself to go back and realize that maybe that's not right. Like, for one, I love CNN, but sometimes I will turn on Fox just to see what is going on, because you have to do that. In order to be educated, you have to be open to other ideas. So accountability and transparency is very crucial to this conversation.
Thank you, Taryn. Thank you. I'd like to take this time to thank our student panelists and Mr. Comey. And I'd like to thank all of you, so give yourselves a hand. If you meet us outside for a student reception, there's chicken.
And it's free, right? It's free? Yeah.
Free chicken, y'all.
And I hope you'll come next month, where I'm going to try to get Dr. Muhammad to join me up here to talk about that course that I think has the opportunity to change the world. So I hope you all enjoy free food, and you'll come back next month when there'll be more free food. Yeah, thank you.
You too. Oh, so you're going to high school. Good luck. Good luck.
Thank you.
Go where I send thee. How shall I send thee?